Now I would like to welcome Jose Estabil. Jose has such a great wide range of experiences that I decided it would probably be best if Jose introduced himself. So Jose, I'm going to bring up your slides. I am going to close the poll and give everybody the results here. And Jose, as soon as those come in, I will give you the controls.
Great. So welcome everybody, and thanks for sharing your lunch with us if you're on the East Coast or wherever else you are in the U.S. or elsewhere in the world. And since I see there's a tab open on the webinar, I'd like to introduce Bill O Farrell, who's a classmate of mine, whom I've been in dialogue with for the last few years when we realized that our paths have brought us both either into or through MIT and have been involved in technical entrepreneurship. And a little later I will invite him to join in a section of the discussion. But with that, I wanted to go ahead and launch. And also I wanted to do a couple of shout outs as I see a couple of my other classmates or friends are on the call. Thanks for your support. And also I see as a preview that the next speaker in this series, Professor Danny Roche, is also on this a webinar also. So with that, I wanted to, if I can figure out how, there we go, tell you a little bit about me. And basically it's that I started my career as a research scientist at IBM and then went to Silicon Valley as a staff scientist and quickly changed into technology and marketing, where I eventually led product teams, built divisions, and then started my own company. And in the process did a number of cool things. But in fact, what might be more interesting that you can't Google about me is that, like some of you, I was not born here. I immigrated here with my parents as a kid. I met my wife while I was at Brown. We have a son that's in second grade. So, and we've lived in a number of different places as a couple. We've pursued our careers, and in fact, that's taken us outside of the U.S. a couple of times. And I've also won awards for both volunteering, product design, and even sales, even though I wasn't doing sales at the time. So, and this, I believe, is what provides some of the foundation for being a good entrepreneur, is being able to see an opportunity and be able to seize it. And the last funny thing about me is I just know a lot about American movies, and that's thanks to Marianne Dones, because I did take a semiotics class before it was called Modern Media and Culture while I was at Brown. So having said that, the reason I hope some of you are on the call today is that there's a lot of discussion, and we here at MIT see a lot of activity in terms of innovation. And I've put up here pictures of people whom I consider some of the more defining innovators of our generation. We've even included the band U2, because not only have they been prolific in terms of their musical output, but individually they've also launched initiatives and campaigns that have been transformational in areas of commerce as well as policy in the U.S. and worldwide. And you know, I want to emphasize that innovators happen everywhere. But in fact, when we look at when these innovators started their journey, they really didn't look like what we think of them looking at now. And in particular, I want to overlay with you the group of founder entrepreneurs from a program that I co-direct in Portugal on behalf of MIT to sort of emphasize that, in fact, at the beginning of this journey, the future is not necessarily predicated on sort of the iconic images. That, in fact, is that I really truly believe anybody can be an innovator. And so what I wanted to sort of share is in this call and what we're doing today is what are some of these characteristics that we believe and rely on in terms of innovation. And I think most of what I'm going to say should be familiar to you, but I wanted to premise it a little bit in terms of a larger view of how I personally have come to see a lot of this, but that's informed by what I see at MIT. And in particular, this is work done by Professor Ed Roberts and Charles Easley, who was his graduate student, in looking at the number of startups that students at schools with significant research programs have been doing, and this is MIT data in particular. By the way, these are data for companies that have been started by MIT undergraduates. And the important thing in this graph is that you see that with each cohort, people are finding their way to starting companies, not just earlier in their career, but the aggregate number of companies that they're starting is also larger within each cohort, even though the size of the undergraduate program has remained stable throughout the course of this year. And this is the course of this time. This is a very similar trend that most universities are observing. And so I think if you're thinking of or have launched a company, I think you're in good standing. I mean, I think this is a path that a lot of more people are taking today than they did, for example, when Bill and I graduated from Brown. Secondly, we see that hubs have sprung up around the U.S. and around the world, and they seem, and I show you a picture here of the Boston Cambridge hub, where they basically concentrate talent, technology, and money. And the idea being that these seem to, whether this is a correlation or causation is a subject of a lot of research. But the fact is in these places, if you are starting a company, you are apt to be able to find engineers, marketing people, salespeople, all sorts of people that you need to build a team, and you're more likely to meet them in these hubs than you might in places that are not like these. And Brown is blessed with being, less than an hour's drive from one of the two major hubs in the U.S., and possibly I should say three, since New York has really made huge strides in this area also. And so I just want to sort of premise that the standing is good. So the structure of this webinar is not a lecture, but given that I'm a university, it's hard to resist slides and going there. So really wanted to try to motivate this through a discussion and through some level of polling. And in particular, there are a few thoughts that I wanted to share to sort of stimulate some questions, etc. First is, who can be a successful technical entrepreneur? In my career, I've seen that nearly everyone can. And how I mean by that is there are some people who believe technical entrepreneurship is something that's an innate quality that you're born with it or you are not. And I was recently on a panel where this seemed to be debated to death, and it sounded a lot like how many angels fit on the head of a pin. In fact, I think what we see here at MIT, and that I've seen certainly in my career and believe also, is that most people have the latent talent. Just some people have more of an aptitude. And if you compare this, to example, to the medical profession, there are lots of roles that one can play in the medical profession that are rewarding to people. So while not everybody who starts off thinking that they want to be a doctor become a doctor, the fact is that as a skill, learning about medicine and being a professional in healthcare is something that is teachable, where you can take the latent talent and add skills to it. So first and foremost, I think if you have an idea about something, I think you can get training. Secondly, I think what winds up defining successful entrepreneurs is a lot of practice at it. Here we normally say entrepreneuring is a contact sport, and what we mean by that is that people take serial, prudent risks, and most of the time fail. And it might be counterintuitive because you mostly hear about success stories, but in fact, one of the key criteria is being able to know when to take a risk, when to bet the farm, as it were. And the wisdom that comes from this is this notion that good judgment, although it comes from experience comes from bad judgment, basically failing. And there are many aphorisms that different people come up with to describe it, but fundamentally prudent risk-taking. And in this area, and what my practice has been over the last 3 or 4 years, it's been really interesting to try to intervene in different places around the world for the purpose of trying to develop innovation programs where there can be exchange with where I live and work here in the Boston-Cambridge area, and then whether it's in Italy or whether it's in Portugal or in Russia, recently trying to understand how people there view risk and how they view a tolerance to risk. And it's I do think that, interestingly enough, here in the U.S., people tend to self-select and go on to entrepreneuring activities because they have a high tolerance, but also because nobody's going to really feel like they were a failure at life because they failed at trying to build a company, which I think is an obstacle or hurdle elsewhere. And then,
Jose, I think your next slide that you have for us really sort of helps, bring that about.
Yes, and so
I know that our last panel that we had, they talked a lot about that. Be willing to fail, and that's a great point.
Yeah, and so just to sort of summarize what these points were, really think that anybody can do this if you set out to. Failure is part of the equation, but failing often and failing fast is kind of the norm here. And this is something that you have to practice. Entrepreneuring is a contact sport. It's hard to do either on your own or not engaging with people. So if you believe my premise that anyone can do it, then the question is, how do you go about doing it? And so what I wanted to share is that the most important thing here that I've seen and what I practice myself is you have to start. Then you have to recruit people into what you're doing, and then you just have to go do it and then iterate on what you are learning. And if you're thinking about where are you going to find people to go on this journey with you, I think some of them are on this call potentially. And in areas, Brown has a number of resources that are available to you that you can leverage. But I think also if you're in one of these hubs, they're either through universities or through some organizations, there are all sorts of events like hacks or competitions or all sorts of places that fundamentally invite people in for the purpose of trying to build a business. In the slides that you'll have access to at the end, I have a list of where you might find some of these. But but fundamentally, and I wanted to share a story here, and I wanted to summarize the point by sort of sharing the story of Airbnb. Airbnb was started by Brian Chesky and Joe Gebbia. They both are RISD grads, and they just had an idea of how to do something fundamentally cool. They got together with Nathan Bacharzik, but they were getting no traction whatsoever. They just had this great concept, did not require a lot of technology, but nobody was paying attention to them. And what they wound up doing in the last election cycle was to get somebody to get some cereal boxes, cornflakes or something, and basically make one brand Obama and the other brand McCain. And they just completely, so to fund themselves, they showed their talent at marketing and positioning, which is a huge skill needed to start a business. And they basically were able to get the attention of the Y Combinator's founder, Paul Graham, and got into their program and got their initial investment, and through Y Combinator were able to then take off and get serious investors. In fact, some of the best investors in Silicon Valley. And so, but these folks fundamentally were classmates, and what I'm sharing with you is that we're privileged as alums to sort of have a good network. And again, they had to practice at it. Nobody starts and does this, in the first few months of what they're doing. It takes time. And so that sort of leads me to a discussion of, what kind of first steps to do. And as I was sharing before, the first step to do is to go recruit people. And in my experience, the best people to go recruit first are advisors. People who've done it before or for some reason can somehow stack the deck in your favor. And these are advisors that can help you with strategy, big picture type questions, potential people who can help fill your board, people who can help you with the technology, basically the widget that you're going to need to solve the problem that you've identified, and then people who understand how the market that buys this widget or service, how do they buy it? When do they buy it? Are there characteristics that are particular to it? And fundamentally, all of these people are working for you and putting wind in your sail when you're doing your startup to basically provide you what you need to get to, which are customers and financing. Typically, one of the Heather, can you move my next slide forward, please?
Yes, I can. I was just trying to get to your next poll, so
Okay, sorry. So what I wanted to share, can you go one slide back, please? Oh, no. Whoa.
Yes.
Can
hold on a second. Sorry about that.
Pilot error. Yes. Can you go back one slide?
Can
you go back?
Right
there you go.
Here,
what I wanted to share.
The control, Jose. There you go.
Thank you. So what I typically see in the deals going on here, and what I participated in, is you don't pay these advisors very much, and you certainly don't pay them any cash. But in equity, you only give them a sliver of what you're doing. And part of the reason for that is you really want to preserve equity to be able to help build a team for people whom are going to put in very long hours and are going to contribute to creating the culture of what you're doing in your company. And, 0.5% to 1% might sound small, but total company, particularly if they're bringing you to funding. But the fact is, if you're successful at what you're doing, this 0.5% to 1% could turn into $1 million to $2 million at exit for an advisor, which, is not a bad return, given that they're opening doors and are doing so integrated in what they're going out and doing on a day-to-day basis. And so, having said that, how do you know that you're building a team? And what I wanted to share with you is that if you're on a team or you're about to build a team, this picture is typically what many of us have been schooled to do, especially if we've been in larger companies or in business school, where you go find people and you recruit based on, I need somebody to be able to do Java or C++, or I need somebody that knows this kind of microbiology technique, etc. And you basically go through the sift of figuring out who's the most reasonable person to hire. But in fact, what I've seen and what we teach here is that when you're doing a startup, you in fact don't know what you're really going to be doing possibly in 3 or 6 months, because you need to be able to pivot. So you really want people who are going to be nimble and work with you. So character winds up being one of the most important considerations up front, particularly since you're going to be spending a lot of time with folks. And so you sort of have to think of this differently and make decisions based on optimizing or managing the most important asset that you have when you're a young company, which is the people that you have, whom you have with you. So it's just something that we try to come up and re-emphasize, and just to sort of emphasize it here, is that really advisors and team are the first steps of what you're doing. And in my experience, even though my background is in physics and I've been creating widgets that use a lot of exotic and sophisticated technologies, the third thing you wind up thinking of is, what is the technology that's going to solve my big problem? And in my personal experience in business to business, that's always been an iterative process in talking to customers, right? Lots of people talk about push versus pull, but in fact, it is something that if you've got a great technology, then go find somebody who can use it and listen to them and iterate and go backwards. But a lot of companies that I see do very well just pivot very quickly on that and do not get hung up on the technology that they've started out with. So, I was going to say, this is one of the,
I've got a couple of questions coming in here, and a couple were
Sure.
about advisors. I didn't know if this might be a good place where we might put some questions in.
Sure, I think this would be great.
Okay. Someone is asking, is it advisors per the total? Are you talking about total number of advisors, or are you saying you should have a couple in each area: strategy, technology, marketing? I believe that's the question.
So I tried describing advisors into three categories. And this is also it's an optimization problem. So if you can get a dynamic advisor that can do all three for you today, then don't get 2 or 3, because you've just spent only 1/3 the amount of capital that you have, which is equity in your company. But in reality, once you start moving up the curve of maturity and getting traction with, and you know you're getting traction by, are people joining your team? Are you getting leads into customers and callbacks to try to sell something? The fact is as you get larger, the amount and the frequency of advice that you need gets larger. So even if you start just with one person, you will find that you will need several people in the not too distant future. And so maybe if you're fortunate and you can start with 3 great advisors, then this, particularly if you're doing a biotech or you're doing something, say in a chip, or you're making a medical device, you will in fact need, because there are sort of formulas that are typical for those types of startups, but there's no right answer. It's, are you getting the advice as a founder that you need in order to be able to move your company forward? And of course, the more advisors you have, generally the multiplicative effect of them opening doors. But remember, as a founder, you always have to balance what you're doing to grow your company, meaning trying to get your product developed, your website launched, your drug or your device through the medical approval process, with the fact that once you have advisors and investors, those people need to be spoken to, they need to be updated, they need a fair amount of handholding. So this winds up being an optimization problem that you generally always feel you don't have enough advisors in some areas, but the fact is the bandwidth that you have to be able to manage your advisors is tapped out. So I hope that answers that question. There's no magic number.
Okay, there's one other question, and as for those of you who came in late, at the beginning, Jose wanted to capture a little bit who was in the audience, and so we said, what's your interest, emphasis? And we had about 16% who were hardware, 20% saying they're interested in software, 4% energy, a couple of biotech, 16% web-based products, and a fair amount of other and not sure. But so there was a hardware question about current cost of patents. Is that prohibitive? What are some barriers to overcoming that cost? Do you have any input about that?
Sure. So intellectual property is not one of the factors I put in this talk, because in intellectual property, if you are doing a tech-based startup, so you're doing something with on social media, or you're doing some kind of sort of cool way of downloading music or all sorts of stuff, very few people actually go seek patents. That's at one end of the spectrum. If you are doing biotech, then for the first 15 years of your company, most of what you're going to have is in fact intellectual property, and so you have a dogged pursuit of protecting it and making sure that all is absolutely well. Hardware startups are somewhere in between, and how I mean that is, for a few $100s, and in fact in the U.S. we enjoy a unique advantage not shared by other countries, and entrepreneurs in other countries have started using the U.S., which is here you can file something called a provisional patent with the U.S. Patent Office for less than $500, and it's essentially a placeholder that says, Patent Office, I've disclosed my technology, so within a year I'm going to convert this into a real patent filing, but it basically serves as a priority date so that you can start selling your product and not invalidating it. In terms of actually then taking the next step and writing a patent, that is pricey, but with the year you're buying yourself time to raise some funds to be able to buy it. In Boston and in the Bay Area and in Texas, not so sure about New York, but because I think most people either cluster to lawyers in one of those 3 places, you can normally get a software patent or a tech type patent filed for about under $5,000. And in fact, you don't have to have your patent lawyer live in the same city you do. And the more work you do yourself in describing what the it of it is, the less work he or she will have to do in filing it. And lawyers bill by the hour. So the more you have them interview you and then write you something and then edit based on what you give feedback, the more expensive. But typically we see about $5,000 as a budget. To get that patent executed, prosecuted all the way to issuance, it's typically another $10,000 to $15,000, depending on what the U.S. Patent Office does. But the most significant part, and why I think that the question is really, are you lining up customers and are you showing that you are connecting your product to something, is, in my opinion, if you have IP and you are not in biotech, you really have about a year to an 18-month window where you're going to get market traction or not. And something that I learned in Silicon Valley is, how do you know to fold and go to the next thing? And the thing is, if you're wildly successful within 2 years, then you know that you've done it, right? There are lots of examples of companies that do this. But in fact, if in 2 years you're still feeling like you need 6 more months to round the corner, the fact is you should be folding what you're doing and thinking of selling what assets you have and move on to the next thing. Because the problem is that those two are good outcomes. The third outcome is the one you want to avoid. Is 6 years down the road, you are still looking for that break within a 6-month window, and you really will have learned nothing in the interim, and you won't really be valuable or contributory to what you set out to do. And the thing about IP is that it's helpful in some businesses, as I said, in biotech. It is helpful in hardware businesses, but if you're starting out and you're thinking about technical entrepreneurship, your first consideration should be about building your team and advisors and getting to a customer. And a provisional patent, which is a few $100s, will buy you a year's worth of time to be able to navigate and do things in a prudent manner that will preserve your ability to patent your idea once you do have the funds to be able to pay for it. I hope that answers the question.
I think that was a fantastic answer. I'm getting a lot of questions coming into me about advisors, seeking your advisors, was that money value per advisor? But I also am recognizing that there's a couple of other great areas for you to cover. So I'm wondering if we should, put this at the end.
What I could do,
then you can really go in depth. And then if people still have more questions, we can, maybe set up a document for that. How would that be?
Sure, I'd be fine. I also tried to answer some. I would have thought I would have seen some of them on the chat side, but I don't see what they are. But I'll try bringing wisdom. But you should know that at least in the business plan competitions or other competitions that I participate, including the one that I've co-architected in Portugal, but the ones I participate here in the Boston Cambridge area, one of the first things that we look for when we see somebody pitching us is, gee, who's advising this person? And I should share with you that despite this being common wisdom, 95% of the pitches I see probably never mention it. And even though they may have advisors, they don't somehow position this as one of the key things they've been able to achieve. Because when somebody's investing in you, the first thing they want to know is, gee, is anybody else investing time with you, right? I mean, has anybody else gone through any diligence of what you are saying to be true, et cetera? And that's why it's so key to develop advisors and why we emphasize it so much here in the educational curriculum at MIT. Anyways, but if I could just move on, I'll keep folding this in. So the next stage, and this is where I thought many of you may be, which is that you've already started companies, you may have advisors with your employees. Like, how do you get noticed? How do you get bought? And I'd really like to have my colleague Bill jump in here because, the only silver bullet I know that answers all investors' questions is my customer tells me that. Once you're selling something, so much of the just like guesswork or like the notion of whether you'll succeed or fail really goes out the door. And the fact is that all businesses that fail have one thing in common, and that's that they don't have enough customers. So, I mean, I just, in technical entrepreneurship, getting to that customer just so greatly enhances the probability of building a good team, of getting advisors, of getting funding, and just doing and having a fun ride at it. And just wanted to share a couple of things that I've learned personally, and sometimes the hard way. And this is a cartoon that I normally use to motivate, which is that, sometimes the thing that you do best is staring you in the face. And as technical entrepreneurs, we somehow feel that we need to explain the science behind what we're doing, when the utility of it might be explained in a much simpler fashion. And in particular, the example that I want to give is one of how the microwave was developed, which kind of, when I was at Brown, I always thought, well, somebody must have invented it, and then there was a microwave. And it turns out somebody named Percy Spencer, while working on something called magnetrons, is credited as the father of the engine that's inside of a microwave. Amana Products came out with the first microwave, it turns out, in the 50s, but in fact it was made as an oven, and then it eventually came as a microwave. It turns out that is not true. It turns out that he did not set out to invent a microwave. He, in fact, was trying to make basically a radio telescope, and for doing communication, and this was during World War II. And it was the fact that he had a candy bar melt that was near him that got him to realize, gee, this is interesting. This is doing something useful. And it's what commercially Amana thought they could do, which was to get away from, a convection oven and basically be able to cook a turkey in 15 minutes. But it turns out even that was not where the product genesis went. It really had to go through another iteration altogether to be able to figure out that there's a consumer product available, to make popcorn and to reheat food. And so when you look at the value that was created in this chain, you see there were different multiple points when people came in and did something. Amana did do something helpful, right? But they didn't make the ultimate microwave, right? And even though the first version of this technology was nearly 6 feet tall and weighed 750 pounds, it had a place and a life to it. And so often what we say here is that perfection is the enemy of good enough. When you're doing a startup, you just need to persuade somebody that what you can do or service that you can provide will be helpful to them in terms of pushing you along. The second example that I wanted to give is one that we see here, particularly around university campuses, that everybody wants to build an app, either an iOS app for an iPhone or an app on Android for stuff, and there are just zillions of this kind of stuff. Some of the most creative stuff that we're seeing are people whom are taking this device and using it as a sensor, as a piece of hardware that can do stuff. In the building that I'm calling you from, there's a network set of iPads that are how you reserve conference rooms and whether you've got the conference room or not. It has nothing to do with entertainment. And an example that came out of MIT recently was to take these iPads, connect them to a mechanical device so that in rural and developing areas, people could do eye checks. So that rather than taking ophthalmologists or optometrists out into rural areas, you could take these devices that could test for basically the onset of and I'm blanking on what it is, but it's cataracts and the like, and you could send the data back over the mobile line to a central place. And so it's a reimagining and a use of a component where, as you can see, the people who founded this company did not have to create a lot of technology in order to do it. They were able to take off-the-shelf parts. In fact, a colleague of mine, Luis Perez-Preva, loves to tell students here the story of the first laser, where the inventor of the laser just bought off-the-shelf parts to make the first laser. He didn't have to invent any of its components. He just had to invent how to put them together. And so that's one of the key things. And one of the other hurdles I see here constantly, and especially in technical entrepreneurship, is the fact that people talk about stuff just in such a complicated manner. And by the way, these are two actual examples. They're not. I didn't make these up. This is stuff that somebody actually shared with me, and upon further conversation realized that in one case, they're making a drug that's 1,000 times more effective than what people know, and in another is that they can make really, really thin screens, which is important in product development, but your customer would never know that unless you provided a simple translation. And I think here we had also wanted to open up for questions. Heather, is that correct? Is this one of the other areas that we were going to do?
Yeah, we were going to see if there were more questions that have come in. I did try and send you, Jose, some of the info about advisors.
Yeah.
It's mainly the questions that are coming in now, but I would encourage all of you to please send your questions. I've been getting most of them privately, so I don't know if you're able to do it with everyone. It's okay if you don't. It works this way as well.
No, privately is fine. So let me share.
Oh, go ahead.
Well, this is a classic example. So when you're seeking advisors and a team, the reason you have advisors is, first of all, they help put up a mirror to you and help you see that you need to speak English and in clear, concise manner. But they also open doors. So in my experience, since the thing that you have little of is cash when you're a startup, is you try to delay every decision that costs cash as long as you can. So when do you incorporate? In a startup that I started with 2 faculty members here a year ago, we waited until we had to enter into a contract with somebody, and we realized that we had to be a legal entity. So we delayed incorporating as long as we could, and the reason is, even when you have no revenue, you have to pay money in the U.S. to maintain your tax ID status, and it turns out that you wind up paying a yearly fee based on the number of shares that you start with the company. And the fact is that generally when you enter into a legal agreement with another party, say a non-disclosure agreement or a commercial agreement, joint development, or if you're going to have investors, or you need to become a company. But it's certainly not the first thing I see people doing. It's not the first thing I've done. And secondly, the compensation that I put before is compensation per person. It's very hard to persuade somebody, since this is the kind of thing of real estate. Why does an apartment cost one thing and not another? This is typically what people here are getting, is 0.5% to 1% for participating. And every advisor views what he or she is doing as unique to that company, and so they're expecting to be recognized for that contribution with equity in the company. But this is always a negotiable point. If you're in a biotech company and you're going to get a Nobel laureate to join your advisory board, you probably would do well to spend more on equity than what they're doing. But if it's a younger person or somebody who's not as proven, but you think has the connection or has the wisdom that you're looking for, you are probably going to tend towards that 0.5% to 1% of what I see. So, having said that, and where I was going, and you'll see these in slides, these considerations that I've put here are the kinds of things that, as sort of wisdom, I've seen people repeatedly, ask of people, companies who are pitching for money, or part of curriculum that we develop for companies that are trying to formulate their thoughts. And I don't want to spend any time on this because this is the subject of a much longer set of lectures, but you will have these, and you can go back and think to yourself when you're starting your company, gee, how are these things helping me? What is keeping my customers up at night, etc. And then there are, once you do believe that you have answers to this and you have a product, if you are a business to business, the question is, who do you call first? And I've given you an example here from my own career, which is when we were launching products, these are the top 20 electronics companies in the world. And you can see that this is dated. This is as of 2011. But the reality is, whenever we were going to launch a new product, we avoided talking to the big people. And the reason for that is a well-known and now documented fact by Clayton Christensen, is that those people at the top are generally not aware of the dynamics of what's changing in their marketplaces. It's why so many companies that have grown large stumble and then become irrelevant. And even since I created this list, some of that has happened to some of the companies on here. It turns out it's the people that are in the second tier, just below the top tier, that are hungry and want to do stuff. And these are the kinds of people to reach out to find out what would be winning for them. Okay? And so this is a specific example, and in market validation and business to business. And I wonder if my colleague and friend Bill would like to jump in here and talk about business to consumer. I've brought in a couple of things like doing inbound marketing and the like, but I wonder if there's anything that you would add to what I've been saying.
Okay.
Am I on?
Oh, you're on. Great. All right.
I am on. Oh, good. We got the right number. Hi, everybody. I guess this is obviously a giant subject. So I don't know if there's any really, kind of pearls of wisdom I could drop that are going to transform anybody's business. But I would say that having spent most of my life doing technology startups, most of my working life, one tends to focus on the technology development and the early customer work. And I would say, however, as sort of all-consuming as that is, I have always found that marketing is really the main challenge. I think that marketing is really hard. I think user acquisition, as the term now is, in particularly in web and internet and mobile businesses, it's referred to, is a really difficult, very expensive process frequently. It's hard to do cheaply. It's hard to do well. So I think that it really, if anyone's considering those businesses, I think it's relatively straightforward to sort of figure out how to get 100 or 200 or 500 users. And there's lots of different ways of doing that. I mean, you can go with sort of your friends and reach out through networks. You can do some emailing. You can do some you can leverage things like Facebook and the connections you have on that. But really, if your business is dependent on getting tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands, millions of users, the whole user acquisition and marketing strategy is just something that really needs to be considered up front. And it's not a straightforward process, and it is invariably where the venture guys sort of step back and evaluate the cost of user acquisition versus the lifetime value of that user. So Jose, I don't know exactly where I should sort of jump in. There's not a lot of time, so I don't want to take up.
Sorry, I'm on mute. This was a part that we also wanted to stop and ask questions. Two things that I would add to what Bill is saying. By the way, I agree that this is normally for technical entrepreneurs a part where it gets hard, which is talking about and developing your sales and what the marketing is. And by the way, this is often mistaken as what you're telling people outside the company you're doing. This is also what you're telling your team you're doing, so that you're constantly reinforcing the focus and the mission of what you're about. In the last few years, however, there seem to be two trends that I see here in terms of companies going on. One is the use of web-based techniques like what HubSpot has popularized called inbound marketing, which is a way of not cheating, but a way of driving traffic to your website that increases the opportunity for your product to be found on Google. And they have a whole bunch of technique. I highly encourage you to Google HubSpot and look at inbound marketing. It's there. They've been one of the fastest growing companies in the East Coast because of the wide adoption that they've gotten. But it's a technique that works for many different products, and so it winds up being a very useful tool. The second thing that I think is still a developing story is using crowdfunding sites. Most people think of crowdfunding sites as a way of bypassing either angels, or when you may, if you're not in an area that has a lot of angels, or if you're not ready for venture capital. But sites like Kickstarter wind up being a place to find your first set of customers. And there are two startups that are here in the local system that I know they're in the top 10, but they might be in like even the top 5 of companies that have raised money on Kickstarter. One raised over $500,000. The other, I think, close to $2 million on Kickstarter. The $500,000 one are people who are making shirts. They're called Ministry of Supply, and they're using cool technology for fabrics, but they fundamentally reached out, and part of their marketing campaign was to use a crowdsourcing site. And the second is Formlabs, who essentially can make a gadget from a 3D printer. So I don't know if you know out there what a 3D printer is, but fundamentally it's making something, tangible based on designs, on computer-aided design frameworks. And they both found their market space, their initial customers, through a crowdfunding site. And so those, to me, are interesting opportunities that I think are extensible, that many businesses can look at. But these are tools for connecting your business to consumers. But it probably will not get you much traction at Intel, won't get you much traction at Johnson & Johnson, because you're not selling to consumers, you're selling to a focused number of people in that space. I don't know if there are any other, are there any kind of questions, Heather? I see you wrote here HubSpot inbound marketing. Is there, or for Bill, are there any questions? We do have a couple of minutes that we can spend further on here. Because this is the hard part. It's hard to build a team. It's hard to get finance. It's hard to build your technology. I don't mean to downplay it, but it's also really hard to get somebody to know that what you're doing is helpful to them, and then persuading them to part with their money so that they can buy your product or service.
Well, just one question about for Bill about his current venture, and if he could just say a few words about that. And then a question about using family, friends as advisors. I think you talked a little bit about that with me the other day. So 2 questions.
Am I still unmuted, Heather?
Yes, you're on.
Okay. So my current company, which is pretty new, is actually a spin-off that started with it was originally at Brown. It was in the computer vision area. The professor is a guy named Michael Black. He was at Brown for a long time. Just recently moved to Max Planck in Germany. He's a director there. And the technology is basically using computer vision algorithms to create highly accurate 3D body models out of scans from either high-end scanning machines or hopefully we're hoping much cheaper things like a Connect box from Microsoft or a cell phone, a scanner on a cell phone. And there are lots of applications. There's a lot of applications in retail apparel because we can take a scan of somebody and output their measurements. Lots of applications in computer-aided design for product development. We've been talking to the Army about working with them to help them design Kevlar for women soldiers. So it's a bunch of different applications in a bunch of different areas. And Jose mentioned the 3D printing world. There's a lot of interest in what we do to facilitate some of the 3D printing applications. So that's it. Brand new, unfunded. We just signed all the papers. We've got a license from Brown. We're negotiating a license from Max Planck. So I reckon we'll sort of get underway. There's a couple PhDs, students or postdocs, who are starting as my co-founders, plus Michael Black will be an advisor. And that's the short strokes. I actually have a couple of thoughts on friends and family. If
yeah, why don't you go? Because I'm curious. Yeah.
Well, I think using friends and family as advisors is, is fine if they actually know what they're talking about. So I don't think there's a whole bunch of issues there. I do think, though, that people should never confuse a board of advisors with a board of directors. I mean, those are two very different things. The board of directors is, effectively the governing body of the corporation, and the CEO reports to the board of directors and is effectively the CEO's boss. So I don't, there are good advisors who will make terrible board members, and in fact will be counterproductive on the board, and that's probably a subject for an hour-long webinar as well. But I think that with friends and family, that's often the first place and sometimes the only place you can get early money. So I don't say don't take it. And I'm moving moving off of advice, because advice is cheap and usually free, and moving on to money. I just think one needs to be really mindful of what kind of money that is. Usually friends and family money is not an investment made on the fundamentals of the business. Usually it's an investment made because they want to support somebody they love, or at least know. And consequently, I personally feel like one has a much higher obligation to those people, because they're not going to vet you like a professional investor. They're going to take your word on a lot of stuff. Now, you don't have to tell them the thing's going to work, because you won't know that. I think all you really have to tell them is you're going to put your back into it and make your best effort, and if it fails, it fails. But because of that, because you don't know it's going to work, I think you really have to be careful with valuations. You do not want to just overvalue the company. You never want to have an overvalued company, because that leads to all kinds of conflicts with your various stakeholders. But in this particular case, they'll probably give you whatever value you ask for, and so you just need to be really careful. These guys are taking a giant risk, and it's probably the riskiest money there is. You're going to probably have to raise more money after that, so you want to make sure that there's a step up in valuation between their round and the round you eventually. You don't want to have to go back to them and say, well, you invested at $10 million, and now there's a bunch of venture capitalists who are investing at $5 million. That just sort of makes you look bad, and is no fair to them. And the last part is, you really don't want to be sitting at the Thanksgiving dinner table promoting and effectively obfuscating. If things are going well, that's great, but you don't want to have to sort of pretend all the time things are going well. You want to be able to tell these guys the truth. So I just think taking friends and family money, to me, is fine and almost invariably necessary, particularly for kind of first-time startups. But it's just it's money that's different than institutional money, and I think you really want to just make sure these guys get a good deal. And the other thing is, you absolutely, unequivocally never want to take money they can't afford to lose, because there's just no way you can guarantee that you're not going to lose it. Anyway, so that's my 2-minute exercise.
Yeah,
friends and family money.
In fact, I couldn't agree more. In fact, I would have started at that last point that Bill said, if only because that was my own personal experience. Because even though you're telling your aunt or your cousins that tell me you're just going to throw this money away as opposed to giving it to me, the fact is, every time you see them thereafter, if you feel like you have to give them, like sugarcoating what's going on in the company, it meant that they never understood what the risks were. And if you took money from them, they had to sign a bunch of legal papers that fundamentally said that. And so I've often thought business is business and friends are friends. Taking them on as advisors, if they have domain knowledge about something, of course, it's great. The cost of their acquisition hopefully is zero. But it isn't, this is if you're building a business that you want to scale and grow large, you're fundamentally setting something up where you may have to exit, because no matter how great you are at starting the company and getting it going, you may not be the right person to grow it. This is an enterprise for professionals. As a family, you may be able to do that, but don't predicate your success on it being a family business, which in fact often gets to an issue that we see overseas in terms of how people think of stuff. But they're a good source of initial funds, and this is a chart that I've put up here that you'll have access to. The fact is that money is what enables you to reach customers and to grow your business, but money absent wisdom is money not worth getting, because it just really is dilutive to the number of hours you have in the day to be able to get to where you want to go. So I really don't want to spend, I mean, we're almost at the end of this, so I never meant to spend a lot of time on here, and this is worthy of at least several lectures. So, but you'll have at least a guide of what we typically see for the size of deals and the different places that you can get monies from. And so in sort of closing, there are a couple of slides that you'll have access to and websites where can you find like-minded people? Or so if you've got a product that's a great 3D printer and you are not a $10 million company at or $100 million, how do you know who your competitors are? One of the things that I found as a useful tool is to go find places where people are up and coming. Remember, whoever's out in the marketplace today is in fact a little bit like a sitting duck, but as a new company, you're vying for share of mind of an investor, and he or she as an investor is hearing similar pitches from other people. So if you want to know who else is in the game and playing, there are a number of different places where you can see what are the teams that are pitching ideas and what are those ideas about. And you can find them in crowdsource funding sites from competitions like at Brown, MIT, Berkeley, Stanford, Rice. They're state-run programs. This is the alphabet soup of programs that are here in the state of Massachusetts, but New York has them, California has them, Texas, yada, yada, yada. And then there are accelerators, which are in and of themselves one of the most interesting manifestations in this sort of, and I mentioned Y Combinator earlier, where, you know, for some companies it's a good investment to try to jump in and become part of these programs, because you wind up getting mentors that have been vetted by the organizations, and they can provide you visibility at the end of their process in something called a demo day. But, you know, it's always caveat emptor, buyer beware. The fact that you didn't get these mentors on your own often means that the fit might not be quite what you want, but it's a great place to start, and there are so many successful stories of companies coming out of here now. Airbnb is only one of them, but there are quite a large number now. And finally, what I wanted to share in this last thing is there are a whole bunch of different places. I mean, I think Bill was just absolutely on the money. Universities like Brown have a bunch of ideas. Faculty make great sources of places for product ideas and for possibly students that can as agents take the technologies out. But the fact is faculty don't leave the universities. At MIT, one of the things that I didn't share is and the report that I talked about in terms of MIT's economic impact shows just thousands and thousands of companies coming out of here over the last 50 years. The reality is only 2 faculty have left MIT to go do a startup. They don't start companies. It's generally their students, or in Bill's case, it sounds like he's doing a second university spin-out. So there's a great source of technology, and the beauty of it, and I think this goes to an earlier question about intellectual property, the way universities work is universities pay for patent costs up to a certain point in hopes that somebody will help take the technology and commercialize it. And generally, they will work with you. If you don't have funding, they will work with you to figure something out so that you're not burning cash. But as soon as you do have cash, they're going to expect you to make them whole on what that patent portfolio is and assume the costs of patenting going forward. And here, there are also some directories and lists. I want to point you out to AngelList. Venture Hacks is so relevant blogs that I follow, for example, or organizations that I know to be very helpful. If you want to know what it means to get funded, what an A round is, what a funding document is, there's a lot of stuff online. And so, you know, there's a lot to cover over an hour, but I hope you've gotten the flavor today of, you know, how to start, which is to start, recruit, and then iterate. And I really want to thank Heather for giving me this opportunity, and Bill for joining me on this webinar today. And
Jose, you were fantastic. And as I suspected, there would be some more information than we could possibly cover in an hour. There were a few questions still out there, and if you get a chance, I'm going to forward those to you, and maybe you could give us some quick info on that we can share. I also want to let people to know that today on Facebook I will share a couple of the resource slides and the graphs, and then the slides will be posted on our website when the video is there as well. thank you all for participating. I can't thank you enough, Jose. And Bill, thank you for jumping in at the last minute. That was wonderful. Just to let all of you know, there are lots of resources available to you, and there are many more webinars that we're trying to set up and come forward. If you have ideas for webinars, please share them with us, either on Facebook or Twitter or at our at email. And just to let you know, our next speaker, we do have this trend of entrepreneurism moving forward, or entrepreneuring, as Jose is going to transform me into saying, with Danny Warshay, and then Diana Wells taking that social entrepreneur. She a view from Ashoka. And I want to thank all of you for today. Thanks, Jose. Do you have anything to say?
Oh my God! Thank you for listening. If you still are, and I wish somehow this technology would enable me to talk to all of you that are on this. So hello, and I hope I see you guys at reunion, or ping me on Facebook or something.